Hi. I'm coming to you today, as you can see from my picnic table. I hope that makes a nice change. There's a little bit of neighborhood mayhem going on, but hopefully it won't be too distracting, and they won't think I'm too crazy, seemingly talking to myself here in my yard. In any case, this will be the lecture for Tuesday, March 9th in our course. And as you guys know, we are starting another 2-week module in our course about early modern traditions of talking and writing about love. In this module, we're going to be learning about specifically Christian traditions of talking about love in the early modern period. And as I indicated already in a Canvas message, this is kind of something we have to do, if you like, if we are to have a survey course like this one in early modern literature and culture, and that's because the period is totally saturated with Christianity and indeed with the stories and traditions and ideas of the Bible. When we are looking at the culture of early modern England and early modern Europe in general, one thing we need to keep in mind is that it is very differently organized as a culture. From the way that ours is today, and the way in which we may think all cultures are, but of course they're not. We are very accustomed today in 21st century Canada to some very strong standards of cultural diversity, and of course that includes religious diversity, and of course that diversity itself includes a very large profile of non-religion, of atheism in our culture. Early modern England just doesn't work like that. It is not only an overwhelmingly religious culture. There's not really any such thing as atheism in early modern England. There will be some exceptions to that rule, but they will actually be very few. So an overwhelmingly religious society, and this I guess is even more important for our purposes in terms of the sheer historical work that we do in a course like this one. It is important for our purposes to be aware that it is also a religiously uniform society, early modern England, to a very large extent. There is almost no such thing as not being a Christian in early modern England. There's even scarcely any such thing as not being a Protestant in early modern England. So, as I said, a highly uniform society and culture from the religious point of view. And moving that general point forward one more step, it is also a culture that is, as I think I've said already, saturated with the Bible, by which I mean that the character stories, figures, and ideas of the Christian Holy Book are known absolutely backwards and forwards and inside out by the members of this culture. And that it may seem as though that goes without saying. It doesn't really, because in the overall history of Christianity up until the early modern period, it had not always been the case, actually, that the Bible was read a lot by ordinary people. In the 16th and 17th centuries, certainly in English culture, anybody who can read reads the Bible. It's just as simple as that, and they know this text extremely well. So, in terms of the sheer historical work that we have to do in a course like this one, we can't ignore this text. And another kind of introductory point, we're reading the version of the Bible that we call the King James Version. It's called that because it was commissioned by King James as a new translation and edition of the Bible, and that was published in 1611. In many ways, the King James Bible, in and of itself, is an extremely, maybe even uniquely important and influential literary production of the early modern period, such that its phrases, its cadences, its poetry are endlessly echoed and repeated down through the period, and certainly right up until the 20th century, I would say. So a uniquely really important text with which we can have a brief encounter in the next couple of weeks. Worth underlining that in doing this, in spending a bit of time with the traditions of love as they are expressed in the Bible, we obviously are not approaching the text in what we can vaguely call a faith-based way, and I wouldn't be able to do that for you guys anyway. We're approaching it under the historical register and the literary register. If we do that, I actually think that we have the opportunity to learn some interesting things from this text and from the literary, let's say, legacy of this text in the early modern period itself. Okay, why then do we need to bring it into our course specifically? What is this tradition, this Christian or biblical tradition of talking about love? Well, there certainly is one, and it is a very, very important one. We kind of have our work cut out for us in that, we don't have time, needless to say, to really have a proper encounter with the Bible. So I'm going to look in this lecture, and we'll probably spend most of our time this week looking just at a very, very restricted selection of scriptures. I've asked you guys to read 3 from the New Testament and 2 from the Old Testament. But I think by doing so, I think we actually can gather up the main points of this tradition. A little bit of neighborhood mayhem going on here. As I said, sorry about that. I'll try to keep focused. Okay, the biblical tradition of talking about love. It's different from the other ones we have learned about so far in this course, although it is also powerfully related to at least one of them, as we'll see, and that's the Neo-Platonic tradition. And I guess the way I'm going to present this is kind of an easy, quick way, first of all, and then in a much harder and more difficult way, second of all. But yeah, the easy, quick way first. And we can do this actually by turning to, I guess, the last of the scriptures that I asked you guys to read, which is a famous chapter from late in the New Testament, St. Paul's epistle to the Christian church at Corinth. So that's called the letter to the Corinthians, and there's 2 of these in the New Testament. So in Bible parlance, they're referred to as 1st and 2nd Corinthians. We're reading a chapter from 1st Corinthians. It's the very famous scripture, 1 Corinthians 13. Now, just before I turn to the scripture, we can give the general idea here actually very, very quickly. And the general idea, theological idea, which again, I'm not selling, but only explaining. The general theological idea that we can talk about in Christianity is, as it is often said in other scriptures, not this one that we're reading, it is the idea that God is love, okay? So the almost essential idea, if you put a whole bunch of Christian theological writings in a pot and cook them down, the essential idea that is supposed to be left at the bottom actually is an idea of love. And as we'll see later on in this lecture and later on this week, that idea of love emerging in Christianity is supposed to exist in a kind of contrast with earlier religious ideas, notably the Jewish ideas that are laid out in the Old Testament. And this is a very complicated business, which again we can only kind of touch on. But the, again, easy, quick idea, whether it makes any sense to us or not, is supposed to be in this Christian tradition that there is a kind of profound connection between the idea or phenomenon of love and the very idea of the divinity of God. And with that, we can then turn to the scripture, which will then enable us to say some more things about this tradition. And it becomes a little bit more complicated and I hope kind of interesting. So I want to turn to this scripture now, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. So for short, we say 1 Corinthians 13. This is, as I've said, a very famous scripture. Some of you guys will know this scripture. And it comes in the context of an attempt by the author, St. Paul, basically to explain what's right, what the moral law is for Christians, and this is in the very earliest years of the church. So there's this new religion emerging in the first place as a heresy within Judaism. This new religion focused on this guy Jesus of Nazareth. What does it mean? What's right and what's wrong in this new religion? 1 Corinthians, the text from which we have this little selection, is a text in which St. Paul, the author, kind of goes back and forth, racking his brains and tearing his hair out a bit in trying to lay out a moral framework for what is right and what is wrong in this new religion. The chapter that we have, this very famous scripture, is one in which he comes up with what is actually an extraordinarily simple answer. And the answer is love. Now, that word does not actually appear in the King James Version of the scripture. The word that we have here is charity. But I'm going to read a bit of the scripture first and then explain what's going on there, okay? So this is Paul, 1 Corinthians 13, saying very famously, and I think quite movingly, though I speak with the tongues of men and of angels and have not charity, I am become a sounding brass or a tinkling cymbal. And though I have the gift of prophecy and understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and though I have all faith, so that I could remove mountains and have not charity, I am nothing. And though I bestow all my goods to feed the poor, and though I give my body to be burned and have not charity, it profiteth me nothing. Charity suffereth long and is kind. Charity envieth not. Charity vaunteth not itself, is not puffed up, doth not behave itself unseemly, seeketh not her own, is not easily provoked, thinketh no evil, rejoiceth not in iniquity, but rejoiceth in the truth, beareth all things, believeth all things, hopeth all things, endureth all things. Charity never faileth, but whether there be prophecies, they shall fail, whether there be tongues, they shall cease, whether there be knowledge, it shall vanish away. For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when that which is perfect is come, then that which is in part shall be done away. These very, very famous verses. When I was a child, I spake as a child, I understood as a child, I thought as a child. But when I became a man, I put away childish things. For now we see through a glass, darkly. But then face to face, now I know in part, but then shall I know even as also I am known. And now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three. But the greatest of these is charity. Very, very famous lines from 1 Corinthians 13. And at the end of that scripture, what St. Paul is doing is drawing a contrast between the life of this world and the life that is to come. And what he's arguing very passionately and wonderfully, I think, in this scripture is what we've got is this this thing, charity, that he keeps coming back to in this scripture. Now abideth faith, hope, charity, these three, but the greatest of these is charity. Okay, we're supposed to be reading a scripture about the Christian tradition of talking about love and its influence in the early modern period and beyond. And yet we don't find love here, we find this word charity. Well, we need to do just a little bit of work on that to explain what's going on in 1 Corinthians 13. And it's a bit of review work, actually, for us, which is nice. If you recall the work that we did a few weeks ago on the Neo-Platonic tradition of talking about love, we looked at Plato's Symposium and so on. You'll recall, I hope, that I mentioned, and I put these vocabulary terms in the review page for that unit. There's two words in Greek, ancient Greek, for love. One of them is the term eros, which means physical love, sexual love, and that word gets carried over into Latin, eros. The other term the Greeks had, though, was agape, A-G-A-P-E, agape. And that means love, but not sexual love or erotic love. It means higher love, spiritual love, heavenly love. That word, agape, in Latin is caritas, caritas. And what's happening here in the King James Version of 1 Corinthians 13 is actually that we're getting a very direct translation of that Latin, caritas, into the English charity. And there's actually very, very complex reasons for why they wanted that particular translation. It's actually a weird thing about the King James Version of the Bible, and that's why on the Canvas page, even though this is our early modern text, the King James Version, I did give you guys this scripture also in the New International Version of the Bible, and you'll find that the word that appears there, where St. Paul has charity in King James, the word that appears there is love. So charity in this scripture actually means love, but it means that higher love, that spiritual love, you see, and that as distinct from eros, that so-called lower in the Neoplatonic sense, earthly love, temporal love, physical love. So where do we kind of start to grab hold of this Christian tradition of talking about love and its legacy and influence in the early modern period and beyond? Well, we grab onto it through the idea that, yeah, God is supposed to be love in Christianity. And as I've said several times, the whole kind of theological, what's the metaphor? The whole kind of theological stew, if you like, terrible metaphor, I'm sorry, of Christian theology, it is supposed to cook down to a notion of love at the very bottom of the pot. But it is, as we see here in 1 Corinthians 13, it's a higher love that we're talking about, a heavenly love, a spiritual love. And that's why I've given as the title for our module, the title, Heavenly Desire. So yes, it's love, but it's an up there love, not a down here love. This scripture that we're looking at, 1 Corinthians 13, it's coming along around 500 years after Plato's Symposium, and certainly is influenced by, actually, and in the tradition of Plato's Symposium. So there's a lot of Platonism that finds its way into the Bible and into Christianity by both direct and indirect routes. It's a tremendously complex and actually fascinating story. In this case, the point is relatively simple. That Neoplatonic distinction between eros and caritas, between lower and higher love, which we talked about a few weeks ago, that Neoplatonic distinction is kind of carried over wholesale into Christianity. And that becomes this, as I've said several times, essential, fundamental, final Christian theological idea. The idea that God is love, but a higher love, spiritual love, heavenly love. I said a few moments ago that's kind of the quick and easy version of the story. Having laid that out, I think we quickly see how it transitions, let's say, into a longer and more difficult version of the story, and a more interesting version of the story. Because, of course, as soon as you have the idea of heavenly love as opposed to lower love, human love, physical love, and so on, as soon as you have that idea, you have, you have something very difficult. You have a contrast, you have perhaps a paradox. And it's a paradox which, again, we can express through Shakespeare's wonderful, tantalizing half-line in Sonnet 116, which gives us the whole kind of heading and theme for our course. Love is not love. The God of Christianity is supposed to be love, yes, but not love, you see. Heavenly love, yes, but not lower love, physical love, human love. So it is a love that is not love, in a sense, which is essential to this aspect of Christian tradition. And that, as we'll see, is a very difficult idea, a very kind of tantalizing idea. In some ways, it's a rather painful idea. But we'll come to that at the end of the story rather than here at the beginning. Now, we've started at the end, in a sense, starting with this very late theological writing of the New Testament. What I want to do now is tell the story again, but in that longer and harder way. And in order to do that, we need to go back to the two scriptures, just two little scriptures, little chapters from the Old Testament that I asked you guys to read. I asked you guys to look at Genesis chapter 22 and at the book of Leviticus chapter 20. And I'm going to talk about those now. Now, in order to do that, we just need to pause and make some very basic but essential observations about the structure of the Bible as a text. And to some of you, this will be extremely old news. To others of you, it will be extremely new news. Let's try to work together on that. When we're looking at the Christian Bible, we're looking at a unique text, let's say, in the history of the world, and it is a text with a very, very remarkable both narrative and, let's say, theological structure. The Christian Bible, of course, is based on the Jewish Bible, what comes to be in Christianity the Old Testament. But basically, the scriptures of Judaism, already a very ancient religion by the time Christianity comes along 2,000 years ago, the scriptures of Judaism are basically picked up wholesale and carried over into this new religion of Christianity. The New Testament then is added on top of them, and you get the Christian Bible. Very, very strange in a way, very puzzling, very powerful. In some ways, it's a very paradoxical structure for this text, the Bible, to have. In some ways, it's a very, very eclectic thing, a very confusing thing, this aspect, this very basic aspect of the Bible. The reason it happened, to put it very, very crudely, is because Christianity, in the first place, was a form of Judaism. Christianity grew out of Judaism and was, in the first place, a Jewish heresy, which means an attitude toward Judaism that was considered to be, deeply wrong and sinful by the established religious authorities. So Christianity, in the first place, is a Jewish heresy, and of course, in the first place, if we go back to the very earliest years of the church, 2,000 years ago, in the first place, all of the first Christians were Jews who had taken on this new version of their faith. And that's, again, a very, very complex, interesting story. Anyway, when we are looking at the Bible, we are actually looking at kind of two texts in one. In terms of the largest structure of this text, this exceedingly important text in the history of the world, it is the Jewish Bible, which becomes the Old Testament, with the stories of Jesus of Nazareth and a set of theological writings parked on top, and that's the New Testament. The Old Testament is brought into the new religion. The old religion, in a sense, is brought into the new religion. Judaism brought into Christianity. But the very, very powerful and, from a Jewish point of view, offensive, to be sure, and very paradoxical idea that occurs in Christianity is that when Christianity, so to speak, appropriates Judaism, as we would say today, when Christianity appropriates Judaism, it also reveals, illuminates Judaism. And again, from a Jewish point of view, that's a completely unacceptable notion, but that is the fundamental Christian idea. And I'm pausing on this as a prelude to turning to our first Old Testament scripture, Genesis 22. Because I want to be able to make the point that a scripture like this one, which is also very, very famous from the very first book of the Old Testament, the book of Genesis, a scripture like this one, a Jewish scripture like this one, is carried over wholesale into Christianity, as I've said. And yet it's carried over under a heading of a kind of radical reinterpretation, or at least radical possibility of reinterpretation. And when we turn to Genesis 22, as we will right now, and when we turn to it under the heading of our course, and under the heading of this module, the Christian tradition of talking about love, which we've just introduced through 1 Corinthians 13, God is love, all that stuff. When we turn to Genesis 22, we see why, let's say, a radical reinterpretation of a scripture like this one is needed in Christianity, and why, indeed, the Christian tradition and discourse of talking about love in the early modern period is going to become something very complex, very challenging, very difficult. Okay, so Genesis 22, I won't read all of this because it's a bit too long for our purposes, but I'll just summarize what's going on in this very famous story. It's a very tough story to get with. It is one of the stories in Genesis of Abraham, the original Jewish patriarch or father of the Jewish people, because of course telling an origin story for the Jewish people is what the book of Genesis does. Abraham, the original or first patriarch of the Jewish people, in a sequence of stories here, which some of you guys again will know very well. Abraham's very old, he's 99, he's childless. His wife Sarah is 89, and she is supposed to be barren in the sense that she can't have children. God nonetheless comes to them in an earlier scripture and says, I'm going to give you a baby. They actually laugh at him initially because it's so ridiculous, which is an amazing detail, I think. But no, they duly get a baby, a son, a kind of miracle baby who's called Isaac. Genesis 22, this very, very difficult story, is a story in which God comes to Abraham, and this part I will read rather than summarize it, and says, now I'm looking at Genesis 22, we'll start from the beginning. It came to pass after these things that God did tempt Abraham, and said unto him, Abraham, and he said, Behold, here I am. And he said, Take now thy son, thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, and get thee into the land of Moriah, and offer him there for a burnt offering upon one of the mountains which I will tell thee of. A burnt offering, we can pause there to make very explicit what's going on. Ancient Judaism, like many, many religions of the ancient Mediterranean world, was fundamentally a religion of animal sacrifice. So you sacrifice usually a herd animal, a ram or a sheep or a goat or a cow, and you burn part of it as an offering to God, and later at least in the Old Testament, the rule is that the priests eat the rest. But what matters for our purposes is just the simple idea that this is we're invoking here, let's say, what's a kind of standard operating procedure for ancient Judaism and many other ancient religions. It's sacrificing an animal to God. However, what God is ordering Abraham to do in this very, very difficult story is not to sacrifice an animal, but to sacrifice Isaac, his only son. Thine only son Isaac, whom thou lovest, as the divine voice emphasizes and underlines very painfully in the second verse of the scripture. So take Isaac, your miracle baby, go to this mountain in the land of Moriah and offer him up for a burnt offering. That means kill him and burn him. I mean, it could not be a more horrific story on the face of it. What happens, of course, as the story goes on is that Abraham obeys. Abraham obeys unflinchingly and unhesitatingly. They travel for 3 days. They come to this mountain. They walk up the mountain. Isaac carries the wood up the mountain, which always strikes me as an extraordinarily painful narrative detail. At one point, as they're walking up the mountain, will be in verse 7, Isaac actually asks his dad. He says, "Well, I see we're here. We've got the fire. We've got the wood. Where's the ram that we're gonna kill?" Abraham says, or the lamb. Abraham says, "My son God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering," and so up they go. The story comes to the point where Abraham is reaching out with his knife to kill his son. At exactly that moment, an angel intervenes and says, no, Abraham, stop. You passed the test. You don't have to kill Isaac. Here's a ram. Kill the ram instead and offer him for a burnt offering. And I added to the canvas page a very famous, powerful, amazing painting of this moment from the early 17th century by the great Caravaggio, The Sacrifice of Isaac, from 1602, which depicts exactly that moment when the angel intervenes as Abraham is about to do that terrible deed. Why did I add this scripture into our very brief little tour of the biblical Christian tradition of talking about love? Well, because it's obviously a very tough one, precisely for that Christian theological idea, which I've referred to several times already, that God is love. And those of you guys who have ever spent time in Sunday school or in church will indeed have heard that before. God is love. Well, there is, of course, within the traditions of the Bible and of the church, a highly developed answer to the question that a scripture like Genesis 22 seems to put before us. But the question that it seems to put before us certainly is something like, what the heck do you mean God is love? How does a scripture like this one, Genesis 22, match up with or fit with that St. Paul stuff that we looked at earlier, faith, hope, charity, which means love. Of these, the greatest is love. That heavenly love, which supposedly is the answer to every question. Well, is it the answer to this question? That's not so easy to see. So again, there's a long and difficult version of this story as well, in which the very idea in Christianity, the very idea that God is love, that idea perhaps we could say, becomes more problematic, not less, on closer examination. And certainly when we kind of pick up that idea, that God is love idea, and try to propagate it backwards into the deeper structures of the Bible, back into a scripture like this one, for example, Genesis 22. Even though the church will have, as I said, highly developed explanations for how we can do that, well, we certainly feel, I think, that some explanation is needed, let's put it that way, for how we can make that connection from a scripture like Genesis 22 up to a scripture like 1 Corinthians 13. Now, the other Old Testament scripture that I asked you to read, it's not as narratively horrific as Genesis 22, but it's a tough one. Leviticus chapter 20. Leviticus, again, as some of you guys will know, is an Old Testament book of laws, basically. And we actually should pause a bit on that point. If in the New Testament, the specifically Christian part of the Christian Bible, if in the New Testament the ruling idea or the answer to every question is supposed to be an idea of love, albeit heavenly love, in the Old Testament, the ruling idea and the idea that is supposed to be the answer to every question is an idea of law, okay? Laws laid down by God for the Jewish people, his chosen people, as identified in the first several books of the Bible. And a great deal of time, certainly in the first 5 books of the Bible, a great deal of time is spent on laying out, detailing, codifying the Jewish law. Leviticus is one of the books in which laws are given and punishments are given for people who break these laws. So Leviticus chapter 20 comes into our course because of the, let's say, specific nature of the offenses with which Leviticus 20 seems to be concerned. They are offenses, let's say, to go back to our Greek terminology, they are offenses of eros, that other kind of love, not that brother kind of love, as Leonard Cohen says, physical love, sexual love. So we can pick this up from, let's say, Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, okay? So Leviticus chapter 20, verse 10, which reads, so this is God speaking to Moses. And he says, and the man that committeth adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And the man that lieth with his father's wife hath uncovered his father's nakedness. Both of them shall surely be put to death. Their blood shall be upon them. And if a man lie with his daughter-in-law, both of them shall surely be put to death. They have wrought confusion, their blood shall be upon them. If a man also lie with mankind, same sex, in other words, if a man also lie with mankind as he lieth with a woman, both of them have committed an abomination. They shall surely be put to death, their blood shall be upon them. So Leviticus 20 is one of the scriptures that people point to and call upon when they want to make a claim, and of course it's a claim with a pretty strong basis here for Christianity being necessarily homophobic, that kind of thing. And there's certainly a strong reading for that kind of claim here in Leviticus 20. For our purposes, what I would like us to note is simply that in this Old Testament dispensation that we have here in this scripture, physical love, sexual love, erotic love is certainly treated as morally and religiously problematic, a minefield. And the punishment for transgressions in this area under the Old Testament law are very, very severe, and as we saw in that scripture, the bit that I just read, it's very typically putting to death. So if you, according to the law of Leviticus, if you commit one of these sexual offenses, such as adultery, and that's the one that we can hold on to as we go forward in our readings, if you commit one of these offenses, well, the punishment is severe and direct and unquestionable and simple. The punishment is death. And typically in Leviticus, it's death by stoning, okay? That scripture, that part of the scripture I just read did not actually make that explicit, but very typically in Leviticus, it's punishment by stoning. So it is extremely harsh. The status of that kind of love in this part of the Bible, the Old Testament part, that the status of erotic love is very problematic, very, very strictly regulated, and breakings of the regulations, of the rules, of the law are punished with death, with stoning to death. So it's very, very harsh stuff. Now, to wrap up this beginning of our look at this module, we're trying to do something almost impossible here, which is sketch very, very complex theological ideas in a very, very brief amount of time. But to wrap up this part of our introductory look at this stuff, let's try to do so as follows. As I was saying a few moments ago, the Bible has this very strange, very paradoxical structure whereby the Old Testament, the Jewish Bible, is brought wholesale into the new religion of Christianity. And what that means as a result is that the New Testament, again, the specifically Christian part of the Christian Bible, the New Testament consists in part in radical reinterpretations of the Old Testament. And in some cases, they really are very radical reinterpretations of the Old Testament. And it's that structure of reinterpretation that I want us to just be aware of as we go into this module of our course, because it's through that structure, through that that move, let's say, of radical reinterpretation that we're going to get to the Christian idea that we've already pointed to and talked about, the idea of there being an essential identity between the meaning, the fundamental meaning of the religion and the phenomenon, the idea of love. Perhaps we don't feel that we have that when we're in the world of Genesis 22. Perhaps we don't feel that we have that when we are in the world of Leviticus 20. The New Testament, through some very, very crucial scriptures, tries to turn those scriptures and scriptures like them into love scriptures, which is pretty amazing. And we have time to look at least one of those two remaining New Testament scriptures that I asked you guys to read. It's going to be John chapter 8. And this is a scripture that actually connects back directly to Leviticus 20, the scripture that we just read. John chapter 8, so we're looking at a selection from the Gospel of John. The Gospels being a set of 4 books at the beginning of the New Testament that tell slightly different versions of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. The Gospel of John is the last of the 4. It is the most. It is the gospel that differs most from the other gospels, and it is a gospel of some very amazing and in some ways quite subversive stories. Actually, John chapter 8 being one of them. And so I'm just going to read this. It'll be the first, I think it's 11 verses of this chapter. So John chapter 8, Jesus went unto the Mount of Olives, and early in the morning he came again into the temple, and all the people came unto him, and he sat down and taught them. And the scribes and Pharisees brought unto him. Scribes and Pharisees. Scribes means the guys who work in the temple, the Jewish temple at Jerusalem, as kind of clerical assistants to the priests. Pharisees are a very important kind of person in the New Testament. They are or were a kind of very conservative, we could even say fundamentalist Jewish reform sect in the period of the life of Christ. And as some of you guys will know, Pharisees and their near neighbors, the Sadducees, they're always kind of getting at the Jesus of the Gospels in various ways, trying to get him in trouble. And this is one of the scriptures where that happens. So John 8, verse 3 now. The scribes and Pharisees brought unto him a woman taken in adultery, and when they had set her in the midst, so in the middle of this group of people, they say unto him, Master, this woman was taken in adultery in the very act. So she's been caught in the very act of committing adultery. Now Moses in the law commanded us that such should be stoned, but what sayest thou? This they said, tempting him that they might have to accuse him. But Jesus stooped down, and with his finger wrote on the ground, as though he heard them not. So when they continued asking him, he lifted up himself and said unto them, He that is without sin among you, let him first cast a stone at her. And again he stooped down and wrote on the ground. And they which heard it, being convicted by their own conscience, went out one by one, beginning at the eldest, even unto the last. And Jesus was left alone, and the woman standing in the midst. When Jesus had lifted up himself, and saw none but the woman, he said unto her, Woman, where are those thine accusers? Hath no man condemned thee? She said, No man, Lord. And Jesus said unto her, Neither do I condemn thee. Go and sin no more. And we'll stop our reading of that scripture there. Now, I'm not going to try to say anything right now about what the heck happens there. I would like to leave that for tutorial and for our work together on Thursday. Let's just note something really interesting happens, or perhaps does not happen there in that story of John chapter 8. And it's a story, as we just saw, that is explicitly connected back to Leviticus 20. Leviticus 20, the scripture that we read a few moments ago, says that adulterous woman must be stoned. And of course, we are more than entitled to ask, where the heck is the guy? Why is she the one in trouble? But anyway, Leviticus 20 very clearly says she must be put to death. That Old Testament scripture is brought into the New Testament situation. And Jesus, who of course is supposed to be the Son of God, is challenged either to enforce the law or to erase the law. And in a rather amazing way, I think, he manages to do neither of those things. And we'll talk about that more again in tutorial and on Thursday. One way or another, we have that Old Testament scripture, Leviticus 20, which is so powerfully coded against sexual adventurism, let's say, crimes of the heart, crimes of eros. We have that scripture in some way undergoing a radical reinterpretation by this man who is supposed to be the Son of God, which means, of course, that he has a unique authority over everything in the Holy Book. Okay, we're running out of time, so I just want to go on very, very quickly and talk about, I won't turn to it, I'll just talk very briefly about the last scripture that I asked you guys to read to begin our work together on this stuff this week. That's also from the Gospel of John. It's John chapter 20. And this, again, is a very famous story. It's after the it's after the crucifixion and death of Jesus, when he rises from the dead, and it is discovered that he has risen from the dead. In John chapter 20, the person who discovers his tomb empty, and then has this initial encounter with the risen Christ, is a woman called Mary Magdalene, who's one of the followers of Jesus, obviously. A female follower, which I think is a very interesting and important detail. And of course, it is not irrelevant at all that she has the same name as his mom, Mary. Mary Magdalene is the one who first discovers that Jesus has risen in John chapter 20, and the first person to meet him and talk to him after he has risen. It's a very famous moment, which we've actually already encountered in the course, from the very beginning of our course, as a matter of fact. Because when she sees him, she goes to hug him like you would, right? In that absolutely incredible situation and moment. She realizes it's him, he's risen from the dead. I mean, what could be more amazing and wonderful than that? Nothing. She goes to hug him, and the Jesus of that scripture says to her very famously, "Touch me not, for I'm not yet ascended to my Father." And the image, the painting that we actually have on our canvas page depicts exactly that moment from John chapter 20. We'll talk about this more on Thursday. There's a whole iconographic tradition based just on that moment. The point I want to make right now to wrap up is it's obviously, in terms of the Christian tradition of thinking about and talking about and writing about love, it's a very painful moment. Because Mary Magdalene, having realized that this guy has actually risen from the dead, and there he is, what kind of comes out of her to him in that moment, of course, is love. And that love wants to express itself in the way that we human creatures do that, which is, not with some kind of mind meld, or not by saying, "Oh, you rose from the dead, that's neat." No, of course not. She wants to rush to him and embrace him, and she can't. He says, "Touch me not." So I guess we end this lecture kind of where we began. We end this lecture where we began, with the point that it is absolutely essential to the whole phenomenon and teaching of Christianity, and absolutely essential to the whole Bible, again, endlessly read in the early modern period, this idea of a profound, essential identity or unity between God and the phenomenon of love. And yet, the Christian version of that idea almost immediately and inevitably reproduces the Neo-Platonic paradox of love, which is, okay, it's love, but not that love. It's higher love, but not lower love. It's spiritual love, but not physical love. And that is supposed to be not only sufficient, that's supposed to be better, let's say. I think we can probably imagine that when Mary Magdalene, in that incredible story of John chapter 20, when she wants to hug him and she's told she can't, under the idea that that spiritual love, heavenly love, is better or superior, well, that's actually a difficult idea, a difficult refusal to swallow. And that's where we can pick up this work next time. Okay, so I'm sorry I went a little bit over time here. Thank you very much, as always, for your attention, and I will see you guys on Thursday. Bye.